Hello everyone, welcome to another day in this, the Clown Decade. The decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better, and today it's more of a roundup of the news than anything, but it has been quite the wild week for Labour. Obviously, 3 of the videos I've covered this week are to do with their immigration white paper, which, while in a good direction and a much better direction than it was going about a week ago, it's still nowhere near where we need it to be, which is going to be rather the theme of probably this video and probably for the next 4 years. That is, of course, assuming they last that long, but I think we'll start off with the good news for Labour. So the UK economy expanded at the fastest pace in a year in the first quarter of 2025, driven by growing business investment and a rise in exports before the imposition of the US tariffs in April. Quarter-on-quarter gross domestic product accelerated by 0.7% between January and March, beating the 0.6% forecast from private sector economists and the Bank of England. It marks the economy's best performance since the start of 2024, and a sharp rise from the 0.1% growth rate recorded at the end of last year. And as you can see from the graph, Britain, its GDP has been effectively stagnant for some time. And as you can see, the odd rise to 0.7 in this case, it went to 0.9 in quarter 1 of 2024, does not mean much more than, well, they did ever so slightly better than expected. And as mentioned, the whole Trump tariff thing has effectively forced the export businesses to go into overdrive to try and get as many sales as possible before pretty much everything slapped with a 10% tariff to America, which is not particularly good. I've not really done a video on the American trade deal, but long story short, we were never going to win with it, but at least we have a better trade deal than if we didn't, I suppose. Anyway, important to note at this point that these are statistics from the ONS. The ONS, where the head of this particular office, Sir Ian Diamond, reside with immediate effect due to health reasons, apparently, but this is at a time when it faced a crisis of confidence in its work. It's got to a point where some public bodies are simply just not trusting ONS data because they get it wrong so often. And it's the ONS that has been miscalculating the fiscal headroom that this Labour government has post-budget, frankly because the way it runs its data is so atrocious. To the point where the Office for Statistics Regulation laid out its concerns about the quality of its own data, and yet barely a week later we still have major reports trusting ONS data. I guarantee once again the ONS is going to have to downgrade this in the coming months, because it always does. So anyway, the ONS said the month-on-month GDP rose by 0.2% in March, down from the 0.5% recorded in February, but above the forecast of a stagnant 0% expected by economists. The figures mean the economy is 1.3% larger over the past 12 months, which, hooray, but how's GDP per capita? Oh, still stagnant. Growth was driven by a 0.7% expansion in the service sector, the large part of the UK economy, which makes up about 3/4 of all output. Okay. The ONS said the production output, which includes manufacturing, rose by 1.1% between January and March, and the output in construction sector was flat. Oh dear. Manufacturing good, but construction being at completely flat at a time when they're supposed to be building 1.5 million houses, I think their target was. Yeah, that's not good. Their manufacturing rising by 1%, that is actually quite surprising. But obviously it's not all good news. Economists warned, however, that the first strong quarter momentum was likely to peter out in the coming months because of economic sentiment that has been hit by the Donald Trump sweeping tariffs on US trading partners, including the UK, on April 2, followed by a 90-day reprieve announced weeks later. The Bank of England said this month that the strong first quarter growth was likely to be short-lived and warned that underlying GDP growth was close to 0.1% in the quarter. Which is quite funny. Already you have economists and the literal Bank of England saying, yeah, we don't trust these statistics. In fact, we think they've been overblown by 0.6%, but it feels incredibly ridiculous to nitpick between 0.7 growth for a quarter and 0.1 for a quarter. Both are pretty dire statistics, to be quite honest with you, especially taking things like immigration into account. If you want to see how little you should actually trust these ONS statistics, the Times goes into this paragraph. The economy is on course to grow by about 1% in 2025, which again is pretty dire, supported by gradually falling interest rates but buffeted by uncertainty over global trading environment. Fair enough. Also, let's not forget Labour's economic policy. Although services were responsible for most of the GDP expansion at the start of the year, private sector surveys suggest that output contracted in the sector in April for the first time in 2 years. Yeah, so this 0.7 may very well, if it is downgraded, maybe it goes to 0.6, 0.5, something like that. But your service sector contracting, it accounts apparently for 3/4 of growth. That contracting That's going to be pretty devastating. The UK posted strong growth figures at the start of last calendar year, but momentum quickly faded in the second half of the year, raising worries about the ONS's measurement of economic activity. Bruna Scarcia, the economist at Morgan Stanley, said the economy was likely to contract in the second quarter and warns that the ONS struggles to seasonally adjust the UK growth data, which leads to booms at the start of the year and a collapse in activity in the second part of the year. And the Treasury Minister told Times Radio they are pleased with the economy and that it has started to make some progress. This is higher than we had been expecting, and we are now the fastest growing economy in G7, wages rising faster than prices. As a worker in the UK, no. In fact, no, I'm going to go further than that. I don't know anyone who got a raise that was what they expected or above what they expected. And in my experience, when I had my pay packet, guess what? Do you know what they told me? Yeah, national insurance, that means we can't give you as much as we'd hoped. And that's a common story with everyone that's still employed. You know, that's assuming you've not been sacked. And in fact, I believe big news that I've been hearing over the past few weeks is that Stoke has a big pottery industry. Well, these pottery industries are going bust, some of which have been in business for over 100 years. And the common thread throughout all of these closures, I believe there's three major ones, and this one is obviously the biggest one given its last 100 years, and just last year got World Craft City status, helped get World Craft City status for Stoke due to their history in pottery. It's all to do with rising prices, increased energy costs, national insurance contributions, and falling sales, because obviously, as much as they try and screw around with the data, pretty much everyone feels like we're in a recession. It's just the numbers are going to have to catch up on that. It's depressing news after depressing news, and hearing GDP is rising really does give way to the whole idea that GDP is just a completely made-up number. It's not that it's made up, it's just that it's very, very easy to get that number when it includes things like a lot of public spending. If you want GDP to be useful, you do it in per capita, or play around with the number in different ways to give you more precise statistics. You want an actual look at the economy, look into specific sector performance indicators. Closing down of companies that last 100 years to this point, good indication that things are going wrong. Anyway, in other news, one of the more, I'd say, strange outcomes from a major news story is that obviously some of Keir Starmer's property got firebombed, and it turns out that it's a Ukrainian who's being charged for it. Roman, Ukrainian last name, 21, is accused of starting fires outside a £2 million house and a flat in North London, as well as torching a vehicle. So this was a serial arsonist. And in the video where I mentioned the firebombing a couple of days ago, I said, oh, this could be a far lefty, a far righty, or someone who's talking about Gaza and Israel, something like that. Turns out I was wrong on every account. This is an immigrant who we don't really know much of his motivations behind this, and I imagine they will come out in court. The most convincing speculation I've seen is the recent changes to the indefinite leave to remain, and effectively this is a man lashing out because he now has to wait here another 5 years, effectively before being able to get benefits. Really not too much more information on the story than this. Beth and David, head of the Crown Prosecution Service Counter-Terrorism Division, said, following a review of the evidence provided by the Met Police Services Counter-Terrorism Command, we've authorised criminal charges against a 21-year-old man after 3 fires in North London. Roman, Ukrainian name, has been charged with the 3 counts of arson with intent to endanger life, or being reckless as to whether life would be endangered, contrary to sections of the Criminal Damage Act 1971. These charges relate to 2 fires at residential addresses in Islington on Sunday and in the Kentish town on Monday, as well as a car fire in the Kentish town on Thursday as well. So he really got around, moving from Islington in London to Kentish towns in the days after. The Crown Prosecution Service reminds all concerned that criminal proceedings against this defendant are now active and that he has a right to a fair trial. It's extremely important that there should be no reporting, commentary or sharing of information online which could in any way prejudice these proceedings. Which is fair enough. We don't know if it's anything to do with counter-terrorism. Counter-terrorism police were indeed investigating it. We've absolutely no idea what his motivations were. What we do know is that he is the suspect for 3 fires and that he is being charged for it. So it's going to be an interesting court case to say the least. Anyway, the final bit of, well, I guess we could call firebombing his residence bad news, but at least they caught the guy, you know what I mean. But the last bit of good news, I suppose you could say, for Labour is that Keir Starmer is confident of securing a UK-EU deal to reset relations. Talks over the weekend on fishing rights, youth mobility and defence will see the Prime Minister attempt to brush off demands for last-minute concessions. Now, I know a lot of you are going to say we don't want close relations to the EU. I am actually fine with a trade deal with the EU. I am also, to be fair, very concerned about what may be conceded here. A youth mobility scheme isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. There were around a time where people are very anxious about immigration, obviously. Not the best look in the world. Especially if it's not the type of deal where we're actually allowed to vet the type of people coming over, let's say. But if you're on a youth mobility scheme, typically you're one of the better ones. Anyway, Starmer is expected to use talks on the sidelines of the meetings to push back on fresh demands from Brussels for concessions in several key areas of reset, including fishing and youth mobility, two of which were rather large issues with the EU. Because making it easier for students to go from one country to another, really don't have too much issue with that, as long as obviously it's very, very temporary and actually enforced. But yeah, that was the issue. Largely it wasn't. On fishing, the government has offered a 4-year deal which keeps the EU's current fishing quota share intact, but Europeans want longer, at least 5 years or indefinitely, according to one diplomat. Well, definitely don't concede that. The EU is also demanding a link between fishing access and Britain's future ability to sell food in the EU without expensive and time-consuming veterinary checks. Ah yes, the EU being that great protectionist racket that the entirety of Remain said was actually a free trade area. Negotiations on a youth mobility visa deal are also struck over European demands over university tuition fees. The EU is calling for European students to pay the same 9,535 tuition fees as Britain's. It's quite amazing. They were £9,000 when I went to uni, and that was over 10 years ago now. They've only gone up by 500. That is definitely not in keeping with inflation. It's kind of no wonder that universities are desperate for foreign students who pay, what is it, 3 times as much per year? It's crazy. Fees begin at 11,400 for non-EU UK students, rising to as much as 38,000 for the most expensive courses. Yeah. Honestly, thinking 4D chess about this, you actually go through with this deal, a lot of the universities won't be able to cope. Or they'll bring in hundreds more university students anyway. However, they will be picking more from the UK pool because EU students do not have the benefit of giving them more money anymore. Or, alternatively just completely change the university process. That's what I'd do. There are also disputes over new Defence and Security Pact, which would allow British arms companies to bid for EU military funding. France is pushing to freeze Britain out of 85% of the €150 billion military rearmament fund, arguing the EU needs to retain strategic autonomy. Well, that's hilarious, isn't it? Well, I suppose it's good to see Starmer is trying to hold his ground on a lot of these concessions, but overall, what is it we actually get out of it? Well, according to the article, they keep calling it a Brexit reset, which doesn't sound great. And it seems that the European figures have taken that to mean, effectively, the EU gets all the rights. We don't have to pay membership, but we also have to make all the concessions and get what back? Slightly more access to the market, but I can't even tell if that's the case because there's nothing in the article to talk about trade. The most detail it goes into is a quote from an ambassador saying that they will make trade between Britain and the EU more frictionless. What exactly that means, the article doesn't actually go into, so the details of what the benefits from all these concessions will actually be is quite hard to determine. But as I say, well done for at least trying to get deals done with the EU. At the end of the day, free trade is still a good thing. You've just got to make sure you don't do what you did with India, which is effectively make it so that all Indian multinational companies in Britain can have a revolving door of Indian workers that are cheaper than British workers. Anyway, that's all the good news that turns out to be not great news. We now just get on to the bad news. Starmer snubbed as Albania rejects plea to take asylum seekers. So for those who don't know, I think literally yesterday, Starmer said there were plans to have return hubs, which obviously Homelanders went absolutely nuts over. Oh my god, remigration. The fine print of this, obviously, is that it's already failed asylum seekers, of which we don't actually have many, because effectively every civil servant is incentivised to give them a green rubber stamp. So it's people who should be deported anyway. But not only that, the place where we wanted to put the hub, which was just the Rwanda plan, but, well, it's actually watered down Rwanda plan, because Rwanda plan was to send all asylum seekers there regardless if they passed or not. It was for processing, and even if they passed processing, they weren't coming back, amazingly, which is just incredible. So not only is it a watered down version of something we already had, they initially got rid of something that we already had because it was a manifesto promise, and then they had to go back on it because it turns out it's not only a popular idea, it actually might be quite a good one. Thanks, Labour. We may as well get into some detail of this. So on his first visit to Albania, the Prime Minister announced that the UK would begin talks with other countries to host return hubs where failed asylum seekers could be sent once they exhaust all avenues of appeal. this is even after appeal. This is something that they won't even have to have in place for something like 5 years. Not only is the asylum seeker application process a lengthy one because of the massive backlog with the hundreds probably of thousands of people in the backlog, but then all those that fail, massive appeal process. This is why we have green rubber stamps, by the way, is to avoid the lengthy and costly appeal process. It's no wonder that people are very sceptical about human rights legislation as it stands. The announcement prompted criticism over its similarities to the Rwanda scheme, which Labour obviously abandoned. Yeah, good. Albania is already hosting 2 migration detention centres for migrants from Italy, and it has previously been identified by government sources as one of the potential locations in the Western Balkans for the hub. However, at a joint press conference with Sakir in Tehran, Edi Rama, the Albanian Prime Minister, rejected the proposals. I've been very clear since day one when we started this process with Italy that it was a one-off with Italy because of our very close relationship, but also because of the geographical situation, which makes sense. We've been asked by several countries if we are open to it, and we have said no because we are loyal to the marriage with Italy. Incredible. Hours after Keir Starmer initially says, oh, we really want this offshoring plan, Albania, it's in the bag, Albania goes, no. We only have that with Italy, because we're right next to them. It's not going well, and it really does not inspire hope in those of us that hope that, effectively, Keir Starmer will at least start in the correct direction about this. And I can't tell you how much I'm going to laugh if he's forced to go cap in hand back to Rwanda over this, when all of the buildings that Britain already funded to be built for these asylum seekers have already been sold off to places like Germany and America, who are also using Rwanda as a third country destination for undesirables. And it turns out Labour scuppered the plan, because then they'd have to give billions of pounds more again to get these buildings built again elsewhere in Rwanda. I can't see it happening. That would be the funniest but also most irritating thing that could happen from all this, and I genuinely think there's a good possibility it will. Thanks, Starmer. No wonder you're doing horrendously. We'll get into the polls after, though. Anyway, in other news, Starmer is also facing a little bit of rebellion as ministers have urged by a cross-party group of MPs to compromise a delay plan to the raise in inheritance tax on farms until 2027. Again, this isn't good enough anyway. That should be a complete scrap. Amid the growing concerns in Westminster about the unintended consequences of the tax rise, the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, which includes 7 MPs, said more time was needed to assess the impact on vulnerable farms. They accused the government of failing to properly consult the policy, leaving a potential impact disputed and unclear. Under current plans, 20% inheritance tax will be levied on agricultural assets worth more than $1 million for the first time in April next year, and basically everyone hates it. However, the ministers are steadfast on this, as they argue that other tax exemptions mean a couple would be able to pass on a family farm to the children worth up to $3 million tax-free, but critics say some family farms could still be hit. In the report published Friday, the Rural Affairs Committee called on the government to push back, announcing its final agricultural property relief and business property relief reforms until October 2026 to come into effect in April 2027. Again, this still isn't good enough. Why are they only pushing it back and not demanding a complete scrap to it? I guess because scrapping this would mean the fiscal rules are completely screwed. And given there's absolutely no fiscal headroom whatsoever, well, it's not particularly looking good. Anyway, I mentioned at the start of this section that this was Labour MPs that are part of this committee. I actually can't find evidence for that, so that's fake news. Don't trust me on that. However, other opposition parties are coming together in total to fight this absolutely absurd inheritance tax on farms, but I can't see them budging. However, Labour have had to make, I say humiliating, I guess it's humiliating for the point this even got to, but they've had to make a step down from the Chagos Islands deal. Thank God for that. So yes, Downing Street has delayed plans to hand over the Chagos Island to Mauritius amid fears of a backlash from Labour MPs over the cost of the multi-billion-pound settlement. Senior government sources said an agreement with Mauritius was ready to sign after President Trump lifted US obligations to the plan in February. But Number 10 has put the deal on hold amid concerns that it will result in a toxic political backlash at a time when Labour MPs are being asked to vote for welfare cuts. Yeah, I've said this quite a lot. An awful lot of pensioners would probably be okay with the cut to the winter fuel allowance if we didn't have stupid stuff like this going on, if billions weren't being spent on illegal immigrants and on asylum seekers / refugees and foreign aid, things like that. But yeah, here we are, having the foreign aid budget. I think that it counts as foreign aid, this. Having the foreign aid budget expanded so that we could pay Mauritius to take our own territory. It's still beyond me how this even got to this point, but thank God. I mean, I say thank God they're stepping back on it. One, it's only on hold, so they still have plans to go through with it. But the second worst part of it is they're not putting it on hold because they've realised, oh, the deal's ridiculous. They're putting it on hold because they're worried about political backlash, i.e. they want votes. And this obviously isn't a good way to vote, to get voters, sorry. Ministers have refused to reveal the final cost of the deal, but the figure is understood to be in the region of 19 million a year for the next century, which is supposed to be up to about 9 billion, but then there are rumours that it could even be as high as 18 billion, and most of that is front-loaded, by the way, so it actually costs us more now than in the future. Again, this is to cede our own territory. At the point at which the agreement is signed, ministers will have to publish details on the financial settlement, which aids Starmer's fear will fuel a backbench rebellion over government's welfare reforms. The Times understands that up to 170 MPs have privately warned ministers that they could vote against the plans or abstain in the vote next month on the measure, which are due to cut £5 billion from the welfare bill. Exactly. This is why people are getting incredibly fed up, because while I have my criticisms on the welfare system, it doesn't make any sense to focus on the cuts there when you're doing a deal with Mauritius that's going to cost £9 billion to cede our own territory, where if you just cut the deal off completely, all of a sudden you don't have to make the cuts you made. Simple as. And still to this day, I don't know a single person that can actually explain why this deal's even going ahead. You barely hear it from the politicians, let alone their supporters, because the main argument seems to be, oh, soft power with African countries. Well, that's just stupid. Do you think the rest of the world is doing soft power there, or do you think China's doing the right thing by having a bit of hard power, investing in infrastructure, and effectively, in all but name, colonising the place? But, well, they don't like talking about that, do they? No, we've got to do soft power. That makes us moral. Okay, well, China wins then. Well done. Honestly, the reasoning from Downing Street sources just show you how out of touch you have to be to think that basically this isn't a bad deal. Like, honestly, listen to this. One source said that senior political figures in Downing Street had successfully argued internally that it was politically toxic to sign the Chagos deal while trying to justify the need to cut welfare spending. So, this is what I mean. They still think it's a good deal. That is the outlook in Downing Street. This is a good deal. It's just, oh, they know we're going to be attacked by the Tories and Reform for giving up sovereignty of the Chagos Islands, but it makes it much worse when they're also being attacked from their own side, they said. Yeah. Everyone with a brain thinks this is a stupid deal. I can't see how anyone can defend this. Yet it took some senior political figures to argue, yeah, this is a really bad look, this is going to make voters think yikes, to get them to just hold it off. They still want to go through with it. It is madness. The deal's ready to go, but Downing Street is refusing to give the green light. Well, thank God that only took everyone telling them it was remarkably stupid to do that. Another source said the Foreign Office and Starmer's National Security Advisor, who negotiated the deal, was still pushing for him to sign it, but were facing an uphill struggle. Everyone on the political side has overreacted to the local election results, they said. There is a huge reluctance to do anything that could be controversial, and a third source said, I don't think we'll be hearing about Chagos for a while. They want to take the sting out of it. Yeah, incredible. So all of this is just, we're delaying it until it's not going to completely destroy our party. I don't know when that's going to be, but it's nuts to think that they think it's ever a good idea. We are run by the worst types of people who could be running a government. The types of people that basically don't think British sovereignty should even exist. Anyway, in other Labour policy that has absolutely no basis in good politics, private school fees rise by 22% after a financial triple whammy. Parents now paying £22,000 a year on average for day schools, despite several institutions absorbing part of the VAT charge, census fines. If your opinion is anything close to private schools shouldn't exist, I have no interest in what you have to say. They seem to be one of the only things that are keeping the education sector in the UK anywhere close to good standing. So the Independent School Council census of its 1,400 members found that the average cost for a private day school was £7,382 per term in January. Labour's VAT policy came into effect on January 1. Fees increased by 8.4% in 2024 and 6.4% in 2023. Not all schools have passed on the full VAT charge this year, meaning that even without it, fees could have risen considerably. Recent analysis by The Telegraph has suggested that schools have passed on about 14%, which would indicate underlying fees have risen by a similar amount to last year. So all this is saying is that fees would have raised anyway by about the 8 to 6% that we saw over the past few years, but obviously it's gone up actually by about 22.6%, which is rather large, given that's an extra 14% or something like that, which is, well, exactly what the Telegraph have said. The full census is due to be published next week, and its figures were given to the BBC. Ministers have said that the VAT policy will help raise £1.1 billion a year by the end of Parliament, which will pay for 6,500 extra state school teachers. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, said it will help provide the highest quality of support and teaching. That's not going to happen, by the way, because of the fiscal headroom thing. And they're probably not getting as much money as they would have thought from this, given the basics of the Laffer curve and the fact that, while there wasn't as much of an exodus as people expected from private to state school, there's still obviously movement there, and that's making the whole thing even worse, because all of a sudden you have someone you don't have to pay for in the state sector moving there. Apparently, a policy paper published in November said the government expected private school fees to rise by about 10% on average as a result of the policy. Julie Robinson, chief executive of the Independent Schools Council, said the independent schools have been faced with a triple whammy of financial blows, which is the added VAT to their fees, the removal of charitable business rates relief, and the rise in national insurance employer contribution rates. These statistics show that school leaders have done what they can to keep the baseline fees to a minimum in face of this unprecedented tax on education. Families with children at private schools are waiting to find out whether their High Court challenge against the government over the VAT has been successful. As several private schools, children who attend them and their parents brought legal action against the Treasury as they claimed the policy of applying tax to fees was discriminatory and incompatible with human rights laws. I really hope that does actually succeed. And given how human rights laws are enforced, there is every chance that it could succeed. This includes those at faith schools and families who have sent their children with special educational needs to private schools. Yeah, it's absurd. A 22% increase is simply absurd, when parents are effectively expecting anywhere between 6 and 8% increase. And even with the added effect of this tax, among others, it was way above the 10%. Even if we're just considering the 14% additional increase, that's still above the 10%. This was a horrific piece of policy, and the only people I see defending it these days are people that are effectively communists and hate private schools even existing, so forget them. Right, what does all this news and all the news since this Labour Party got into power result in? Well, you end up with some of the worst polling numbers I think I've ever seen for a sitting Prime Minister, and I'm talking ones that rival Liz Truss. Keir Starmer's net favourability rating has dropped 12 points in a month to minus 46, his lowest level ever, including a 34-point drop among Labour voters, leaving him more unpopular than popular with them for the first time, which is absolutely absurd. And a lot of this will effectively be down to the fact that they got absolutely decimated at the local council elections, along obviously with the Tories. There's also word that it's because he's going harder on migration, but really I think the real issue here is that he just seems so sincere on the whole damn thing, and it looks like pure opportunism. Plus welfare cuts and other cuts that are being made to the British nationals, while it appears foreign nationals are getting absolutely all of the money still with no cuts or attempt to make cuts being made. Yeah, it's a recipe for a disaster. And just looking at all these comparisons, obviously Reform UK don't like him any more than they did. The Tories actually slightly unfavour him slightly less. Butchered that sentence, but you get the idea. They're largely unchanged. Lib Dems, they disapprove of him even more now, and the big one obviously being the Labour voters. Half are unfavourable with him and only 45% favour him, which is a hell of a switcheroo from the 62% who found him favourable just a month ago to the 33% who didn't. It's a disaster government, and amazingly, the only things that they can do to actually try and save face is effectively carbon copy reform, but in doing so, it makes them look incredibly disingenuous because of their entire election platform. Especially with the whole Rwanda thing and then moving to Albania, it's so see-through. And then obviously looking at the overall statistics, he's just less favourable, more unfavourable. It's a disaster. Doesn't look good. Anyway, compare that to his main rival, Nigel Farage. Opinion on Nigel Farage has become more favourable across the board over the last month, with all Britons now having a net rating of about minus 27. Obviously, Reform UK, especially after the local elections, way more favourable than unfavourable, with a 4% increase to the favourability and a 4% decrease to the unfavourability. Tory voters now ever so slightly approve of him more than disapprove of him. There's definitely a switch going on there. You might even see them actually voting Robert Jenrick next time round if they can oust Kemi Badenoch. Lib Dems, as you can see, even there, slightly more favourable of him, about a 3% increase with a 8% decrease in unfavourability. Pretty good, that. Labour, again, it's the same news across the board. There is more movement towards favourability of Nigel Farage from a month ago, and basically winning local elections, winning any sort of election, this is the way to go. I remember people saying, why are reforms so concentrating so much on local elections? Don't they know they need to get Parliament? You need control everywhere. And also, keeping the momentum up with all these smaller elections, absolutely vital. Honestly, it's completely moved from, I say this all the time, when I went to my first branch meeting for my area in Wales, it was we're realistic, we think getting into opposition is just about manageable in the Welsh Senate, and now they're like, oh, win it, what are we doing? Like, we can win this. It's going to be tough, but it's possible. There's been such a turn in momentum, I couldn't have seen it coming. I don't think anyone could have seen this coming. And it's just incredible to see, and it all makes sense. Labour keeps shooting themselves in the foot, and then when they try and save face, it either looks disingenuous, or when you look into the detail, it's still monumentally foolish. But I'm going to surprise everyone and end this video by agreeing with David Lammy, or at least being on David Lammy's side, because something happened in Paris with him, and again, I'm just completely on his side on this. So French police have charged a taxi driver with stealing luggage and cash from UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy and his wife Nicola Green. The driver allegedly sped off with the couple's luggage after a row over a fare for the 360-mile journey from Forlì in Italy to the French ski resort of Flaine in Haute-Savoie. The driver insisted he was owed €700 in cash for part of the journey not covered by an upfront payment to a booking service, but the Foreign Secretary said in a statement the fare had been paid in full before they set off on their private holiday. The couple had decided to take a private holiday in France after spending 3 days on a state visit to Italy with King Charles and Queen Camilla. Sources say they arranged their own transport at their own expense through the booking company GetTransfer.com. The taxi driver had a row with Ms Green before driving off with their luggage to a police station where he made a complaint. According to the French newspaper La Province, an investigation into the commercial dispute was opened by the Bonneville Prosecution's Office in Haute-Savoie. A member of the Foreign Secretary's office contacted the driver to get the luggage back, and it was allegedly deposited at a police station with a considerable sum of money missing from Ms Green's bag, thought to be equivalent to the amount the driver believed was owed to him. With my experience of European holidays, and not even European holidays, this happened in America, taxi drivers will basically always try and scam you, and if the guy just drove 360 miles, wouldn't shock me too much if he basically thought he deserved a big tip and he thought the €700 was the way to do it. One thing I particularly want to know is, why did he get a taxi from Italy to France? I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that this was probably the most expensive way to do it. A train probably would have been better. And if you're going to cite security issues, I would argue that French taxis aren't exactly more safe than French trains. I mean, politicians get English trains all the time. I don't see why it would be any different. But this is by the by. What I'm saying is I'm completely on David Lammy's side. He was probably being scammed by this taxi driver, wasn't having any of it, and now there's no doubt in my mind this taxi driver is going to face the brunt of the law, especially if he's stolen money off them. This is a ridiculous incident, so if nothing else, this was a funny story to end up on. And if there's one thing that I can say is that I'm not a swivel-eyed loon who hates everything Labour does. Clearly there are some things Labour do that I can agree with, and having a go at the French is definitely one of them, because it was rumoured that as he sped off, David Lammy said, "effing French," which if nothing else shows some level of integration into being British. Anyway, I think with that is everything I had for you for today. To conclude once again, even when it looks like Labour are doing good things, you look into the nitty-gritty detail, it's still just disappointing news. But at least David Lammy gave us some entertainment at the end there. Right, with that, everything I had for you for today. Tomorrow, it's Laughing at the Guardian with some whamming. Tuesday, it's Tosh News. Thursday, it's more Subnautica. Videos out as and when I can make them. If you like the channel, do subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. If you can give a little bit more than that, you can always become a channel member or leave super chats, super thanks. Those are great ways to help out the channel. With that, it's everything I had for you for today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.